Let's look at Lee versus Grant. This is one of the victory games treasures, really, in my view. I haven't played this a whole hell of a lot. A few times solitaire, a couple of times opposed. I think it shines better opposed than solitaire, because it's a very reactive nature of the game. You can say that about a lot of those victory games. This one, how did it come to me? You know, I'm not even sure. I think I picked it up used. Probably back at Crazy Igor's. I used to go there a couple times in a year maybe, and the first time I saw it I was just amazed. Anyway, because I don't remember this in my hot little hands as being a real favorite until a period of my life that correlates well with Crazy Igor's. But it is possible that I had this longer than that. By one means or another, either my dad got it at a tag sale or something like that, or I may have even bought it on my own. I don't seem to think so, though, for some reason. I picked up a lot of my victory games kind of after the fact. There were a couple that, grabbed me right away, Civil War, Pax Britannica, that I had to get, and others that I kind of said, operational in this case, I don't know. And also, limited finances when I was young enough to be buying these when they were coming out, and then college and everything, I stopped buying games for a few years for the most part. Okay, so what's up with this one? What I've heard is that this is something of a precursor to the great campaigns of the American Civil War. I haven't played any of those games. I own a few of them. This one should have gotten to the table long ago. Some of those should have gotten to the table. The Clash of Arms operational area movement game should have gotten to the table already. Unfortunately, I diddle around playing other things, which I would be complaining haven't made it yet, if that was the case. But this is one I have fond memories of in those few playings that I have. Let us take a quick look at some of what's going on. One of the most important things being the terrain chart, because understanding the terrain in this game is a really key facet. And it's not simply a matter of, oh yeah, I know this is a pike and this is a road. But it's more getting the feeling of what the river lines do to you and where the Union supply restrictions essentially come into play. So it takes a certain amount of importance to look at some of these things. First of all, clear terrain is going to cost you 2 movement points to move, which is kind of, that's going to take a little bit of getting used to. Mountains are impassable. Pikes and roads, reduced movement point. The difference between them is, I believe, weather. The pikes are unaffected by the weather. Railroads, they're going to be a potential supply source. They're the Confederate supply source, but they're potentially a Union supply source as well. You have these major river hexes. If they're an unbridgeable major river, I think that's these black lines surrounding it. It's kind of hard to tell, but that doesn't mean no one can ever bridge it. What it means is you can't use your pontoon bridges in order to cross it. Head of navigation, that's going to indicate where the boats, the furthest the ships, the Union ships can get. And it kind of limits, it also shows the limit of where the ports that they can use for supply are. We got normal major river, minor rivers, and then we got little creeks. So the difference between a minor river and a creek is, again, the minor river is traced with lines. No, we don't have movement point costs on those. Those are going to be somewhere else. Bridges, fords. Permanent bridges, which can only be crossed by that player. Forts, which are important for the Union supply. Railroad stations for the two sides. Breastworks, these are pre-built, can't be destroyed, I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. And then these other breastworks here come with a garrison on them. Now, one of the things that's kind of annoying about this game, if I had my plexi up here, I might think about using it. Good old paper map, fine, but Victory Games made their maps kind of a heavier stock than other companies were making them. And they have a little bit of pooch to them. Actually, a number of companies in the 80s started making a slightly heavier stock. I haven't been able to get this one to lie flat, nor most of the Victory Games games. One warning, don't spit vodka on your Victory Games maps. They pooch even more when you do that. And this one hasn't had that, though. That's my Vietnam game. For counters, you have a bunch of informational stuff. Bridges for either side. Breastworks or forts that either side can use these. This is to indicate destroyed Confederate garrisons, which I don't know if you really need because they also have counters on the map. This is for destroying the rail lines. This is for burning the rail stations. This is disturbing because it means my Confederates don't have those markers on them yet. We'll have to get them into place. Union garrisons, which are going to go on their supply depots. Here are the Union supply depots. They take some time to build. They have a building and completed side. You have a bunch of leaders on the map. Now this is a divisional leader because he only has 1 star. Corps leaders all have 2 stars. And their rank, like in the Victory Games Civil War, indicates how many troops they can haul around with them. The number on them is going to be used for movement. Basically, when you want to move, you roll a die, you add that number, and that's how many movement points your force has. And that's all it's used for. It's not a combat value in any sense. The actual troop strengths are marked with generic strength point markers, which I generally like. But here you have one for each individual strength, and basically a leader will have one of these markers under him. Now, the organized side gives you full strength value of it, but then there's a disorganized side, which gives you the strength point value here and the number of men in strength points that are present. So in the disorganized side, you're going to have a weaker strength. You have a little play aid here, track losses. All the different corps have leaders associated with them, divisional leaders, which you can break off. Some of them start on the board already broken off. You have substitute corps leaders. If you lose your corps leaders in the game, they're the only ones who can be killed. You get someone who presumably will probably be worse, although there are some cases where you get an improvement off of that. You track the weather, that's a random event thing. If Union leaders are on board boats, which is only towards the end of the scenario, any bridging trains they may have gathered. Like I said, it's going to be a pulsed system. The way that works is there's going to be 3 action cycles in each turn, and that's tracked here. And each action cycle allows all the leaders that are on the board to be moved to do one thing. And on the back side of a leader, you have a finished side. Hey, we've seen that before. I'm trying to remember what game. Korean War, I think, has it. Another of the Victory Games designs. You also have something similar in Vietnam. It really had this idea of this kind of interactive pulsing of turns. So what's basically going to happen in each of these action cycles is you each roll dice, one person gets the initiative and decides who takes a turn. And that person has to use one of their leaders or just pass, and they're not going to do anything else for the rest of the turn. And there's reasons you don't want to flip your leaders over, because even if you're done doing anything, because you can entrench if you're not flipped over. What do we got here? We got this little valley track that's a little bit of chrome here, and Lee. So there's a random event, Lee can get sick. Otherwise, once, I think, per action cycle, but it may be per turn, he's allowed to affect a combat and give it a bonus. Let's see, what else do we have that hasn't been shown? We have these core-based supply depots. They go on the supply sources or bases, and that's where that core has to trace its supply from. Situationally, you have something kind of interesting. Union Army of the Potomac is cutting down into the wilderness. The Army of the James is down here around Bermuda 100. And Lee is trying to prevent Grant from making it to Richmond. But more than that, he also kind of wants to defeat the Army of the Potomac. The historical situation is such that if he doesn't defeat the Army of the Potomac, it's going to end up being a siege of Richmond and Petersburg. One of them burns. All right. I guess that's enough of very light overview of what's going on. What's that yellow and green stuff up there on the turn record track? I think that's scenario situation. Oh, something I didn't mention, the little bit of chrome on the valley. Basically, you're going to be making rolls against that, and Lee has some troops present in the valley at the beginning of the game to prevent the valley from falling. This is the Shenandoah. And he has the opportunity to call those troops under Breckinridge to help him defend Richmond. But if he does that, he begins to he suffers a modifier on the valley track. If the valley track ends up down in the Union initiative, it puts him, I believe, we'll see when we get to the actual rule, but I think it puts him in a situation where he has to either commit some troops, at which point those troops disappear and they go off to the valley to handle things. Or, and I'm trying to remember what we said there, Hill? And then that's done. Or the Union's going to get some victory points, and it's a fairly significant amount of victory points for basically capturing the valley, because there's no way that Richmond can continue to be fed without a nearby source of food. Okay. Very nice, the rule book. It's your, standard victory games type layout. It takes up a lot of space. It's big. I mean, not in terms of the spread of the paper. It's normal paper, but it's 64 pages. This is not a game that feels like it should be 64 pages of rules, and you kind of see why. Hey, look, there's a compendium of all the leaders, Okay, let's go over the sequence of play. Hey, this is what's really cool. I have a little note of all the sequence of play. This is something my ex-wife did for me. Well, we played it. She won it one of these, and because I would have this chart, and she always wanted the sequence of play. So she would copy it down and keep her own copy of sequence of plays. Back from an era where we worked in a parking garage. Okay. So, in general, there's an administrative cycle, but that won't happen on the first game turn. You roll a couple dice, see if there's a random event and what it is. The Union player is able to shift his depots around to supply sources that he thinks they'll be most effective at. Then leaders have to trace their supply. On turns 6, 7, and 8, the Union is allowed to embark some leaders from a port hex, put them into the embarked leader's box, and then they'll be able to land somewhere else. And one of the ideas there is that you can reinforce the Army of the James down here with some Potomac troops, or you could pull them out, I guess. That's probably a sign of things going terribly wrong. Okay, you're allowed to declare that you're going to begin railroad destruction. Now, this game has actually a basic game, but all the basic game scenarios are one turn, and then the advanced game, which has a number of different scenarios. I'm, of course, going to be playing the campaign. However, maybe I should have played the basic game first. My memory is like with Korean War. This is a game that's very easy to completely screw up because you don't quite get the concepts. And it's been one hell of a long time since I played it, and I suspect I don't quite get the concepts. So I may start it and then roll back and start it again. But I would rather give it a shot to see if I can do a straight through without totally screwing everything up. Okay. Anyway, what happens in the begin railroad destruction, you put a little marker down, and if that force meets certain qualifications and keeps meeting them throughout the turn and doesn't move, doesn't become, keeps meeting them, things like being organized, they'll end up ripping up track on the railway. Now that's important for a couple of reasons. It can cut supply. It's generally something the Union wants to do rather than the Confederates, because the Union isn't really relying on rail supply. And the second thing that it does is if the Union rips up Confederate railways on certain railroads, they're able to gain victory points for having really knocked that railroad out of commission for the near future. Reinforcement phase, starting in turn 3, you roll a die, and you'll get some points of troops that you can allocate to your leaders. And then there's an attachment phase where if you have divisional units in the same hex as one of the corps, they can be absorbed into the corps. And they don't have to stay with their same corps, which can be kind of funky, but whatever. Okay. Then you hit the action cycles. Each player rolls a die. Whoever gets the higher roll will get to choose who takes the next action. And when you take an action, you pick, you can pass, or you pick a leader and you do something with them. After both players have passed, and passing is forever in a cycle, then if you're still on your mobile side, I believe you're allowed to entrench or place bridges. You also are allowed to reorganize. And if you're fatigued, i.e. you did something, you unflip and you're available for the next action cycle. And we do 3 of those. Then we hit the valley cycle. The Confederates have the right to call Breckinridge onto the board. And regardless of whether they do that or not, there's going to be a die roll to see if the valley situation changes. And at the end of each turn except turn 1, Union troops that are embarked back in the administration cycle land on the board. They're out for 1 turn, basically. Railroads that were being destroyed, you complete their destruction. And the Union player is allowed to place 1 supply base marker on the board on its build side, or flip one that he's building to its completed side. And if it's completed, it gets a garrison on it. If it's ever overrun, both it and the garrison are destroyed. And then we plop away turn by turn until we get to the end of the game, whatever that is. In this case, the whole thing. And we score victory points. Or count them. Okay. This is, I believe, to track how many movement points you've used. It seems to go very, very high, but there's forced marches and stuff. Okay. Just looking for stuff that I haven't talked about yet. Okay, zones of control. We haven't talked about those yet. I forgot they existed. All right. So leaders exert a zone of control into their adjacent hexes. There are two kinds of zone of control. If they have 4 or more strength points, it's a primary zone of control. If it's less than that, it's a secondary zone of control. The difference is a primary zone of control goes into any hex adjacent to you. A secondary one only travels, I believe, along roads and pikes. If you enter a zone of control, let's see the effects. They don't go across impassable terrain. Breastworks on their own don't, or with garrisons, don't exert a zone of control. They don't go across permanent bridges. Now, I'm trying to see if we have... All right, I think we'll see that in the movement rolls, but I think they stop you when you move into them. All right, base action segment, we talked about this. Activation. All right, if you do a standard march, this is the normal thing you would do. You roll the die and get your movement point allowance. For cavalry leaders, they roll 2 dice, and they have a larger movement allowance number in general. And that's going to be how many movement points you can move. If you do a forced march, you're going to be disorganizing your men in exchange for more victory point markers. You have to be organized in order to do it. You flip the leader to you flip your strength marker to disorganized, and your movement allowance will be +2 for infantry and +4 for cavalry. Now, let me think about cavalry leaders. You could roll a 12 plus 7 is 19 plus 4 is 23. That doesn't sound like it gets you up to 29, so I don't know why it goes that high, except they had room for 29. Okay, and the final thing you can do as an activation is you can entrench your leader. If it's mobile, you can flip the leader over and you build breastworks. If you don't have anything there, you can improve breastworks to a fort if you're in breastworks already. And that includes breastworks that are on the map. This only affects the troops, for the most part, that you're with. Attachments can end up joining an entrenchment. But remember, if you kind of hold off on using your units, you get to entrench kind of for free with the guys who haven't done anything. Okay. When you're marching, there's 3 things you can do. Movement, attack, and burn a railroad station. Movement, you pay movement point costs based on the terrain effects table. Now this says it's on the charts and tables card. And I bet you, yeah. So here we have like the cost of a creek. It's +2, +3 if it's a rain game turn. Okay. I don't see zone of control on there. Most of these have their movement point costs for the individual hexes, but you also have a reference here, which is pretty useful. Okay. You can attack. If you're adjacent to an enemy hex, you can attack the hex. It's going to cost you 2 movement points plus whatever it would cost to enter that hex. You don't actually enter the hex at that point. And you can burn railroad stations. You have to have a combat value of 2 or more, and it'll cost 4 movement points for infantry, 6 for cavalry, and you get a little burned railroad station marker on there, and these are the railroad stations, and they have victory point values on them. Okay. Can't enter mountains. You have to fight the garrison in order to get through it. Crossing major and minor rivers requires a bridge or ford. Creeks, however, just cost movement points. Zones of control. You must stop when you enter an unoccupied hex in an enemy zone of control. And remember the difference between the primary and secondary. The primaries go all around anywhere the unit could move. The secondaries only down roads. If you enter an enemy zone of control that's occupied by your own friendly forces, you're allowed to keep moving. You only have to stop if you enter an empty enemy zone of control, and you still are allowed to make an attack if you have enough movement points, or burn the railway station. If you start your march in an enemy zone of control, and there are other friendly leaders there, you can move normally. If you begin in an enemy zone of control without friendly leaders, you can't move from one zone of control to another. Stacking. No more than 5 leaders in a given hex. But you're allowed to pass through larger stacks. You just can't end your march or retreat. When you move, you're fatigued at the end of the movement. If your movement marker reaches 0, if you want to quit, if you fight a battle and don't win, and if you choose to entrench. All right, combat's a little funky here. So, you're allowed to attack an adjacent hex that's occupied by 1 or more enemy leaders. You don't have to attack. If you enter the zone of control, though, you have to stop movement if you don't successfully attack. Okay, you state the hex that's your target of attack, and you spend your movement points for the attack. And only the leader who's currently marching actually attacks. Other leaders, though, who are adjacent or in the same hex, have the ability to affect the attack. You can attack multiple times if you have enough movement points and you're not fatigued due to a loss. You can attack with disorganized strength. All enemy units in the defending hex combine their combat values. However, that can't go above 16. Even if you have more total combat strength, you will not be able to add that. You can't attack across stuff you can't move over. Let me decide to spell that all out. All right, the leader's combat value is based on the strength marker and whether it's organized or not. If a defender is under a breastworks, it'll be doubled in strength. If it's under a fort, it's tripled. Now, let's take a look again at this. The maximum combat value is 16. So I think that is affected by this, which is kind of important, because a big stack in entrenchments is not particularly healthier. The attacker states the hex being attacked. You calculate die roll modifiers, which will be listed here, and it uses what Berg likes to call the reductio ad absurdum. This is a Balkowski game, but it uses one of those things. Nafi uses it too in Imperium Romanum. And other modifiers that are in play. The other modifiers are optional. The ratio has to be used. The attacker and defender will each roll a die, and they add their modifiers, and then subtract the defender's die roll from the attacker's die roll. And then you look at the combat results chart, and you compare the combat value to the die roll to see what happens. So in this case, the defender's combat value would be compared to the die roll to see what happens to the attacker. And the attacker's combat value will be compared to the die roll, and the die roll difference, in order to determine what happens to the defender. Okay. So, does that make sense? That does not make sense. I have it backwards. The attacker affects the defender over here based on the defender's combat value. Wow. That is not what I expected. All right. And the attacker's effects are over here based on the attacker's combat value. Okay. So there's a sort of a proportionality going on there. Gotcha. Okay. One of the modifiers that you're going to face, the one that you must take, is you compare the odds ratio, rounded in favor of the defender, and you get a bonus based on that. Terrain has an effect in combat. listed here in defender's die roll modifiers. So like clear, +1, -1, A. Union infantry, okay. Union infantry defending in clear get a +1 modifier. Confederate infantry defending in clear against Union infantry get a -1 modifier. This is because infantry, the Union tended to have more artillery with them. So their strength points factor that in a little bit heavier. So they will get a benefit in clearer terrain. And you'll see the opposite here in forests. Under B, it's the exact opposite. Even though it looks the same, +1, -1. Creek gives a modifier to the defender, +2, +3. E. I see no effect on movement for a creek. Or a ford. Okay. Except during rain. But they do have a combat effect. And breastworks has a -J. What does that mean? Leaders defending in breastworks have their value doubled. Yeah. Okay. Right then. Now, each inactive friendly to the attacker's leader adjacent to the defender's hex at the moment of attack can give a modifier. For each hex adjacent to the defender, including the attacking leader's hex, occupied by inactive friendly leaders with a combined combat value equal to or greater than 1/2 the defender's total combat value, gives the attacker a +1 to their die roll. This can be a mobile or fatigued unit. It can be organized or disorganized, although obviously the strength point factors are different based on that. They can be separated from the defender. No, they have to be able to move. Unforded and unbridged river don't work. And you can get up to 6 bonuses from this if you have the defender completely surrounded. It's kind of an interesting situation. Once per action cycle, the Confederates can throw Lee in to a battle on an attack to give him a +1. And no, he gets a +1 to the die roll on defense as well. Okay. On the first turn of the game, the Confederates get a +1 on their first attack against a Union leader during the first action cycle of turn 1 only. And if he doesn't attack, he doesn't get it. Rain will subtract 1 from the die roll and it favors the defense. The results are written out here. And we got D's, which are disorganized and fatigued. The particular leaders involved in the combat will be flipped over to their fatigued side if they're not fatigued, and their troops will be moved over to their disorganized side, thereby weakening them. Justin F is the leader is fatigued. A small r, like DR here, that'll be disorganized, fatigued, and a retreat. Specific rules on retreat that we'll look at. The capital R is a rout. A little a is advance after combat for the attacker. And any number present is how many manpower value reductions that the leaders involved in the combat will take. And you'll simply replace with a lower value. You have to worry about the complete manpower, not just the current strength in case they're disorganized. The results apply only to the attacking leader and all the defenders. However, the number result is for the stack as a whole. If the manpower is dropped to 0 or less, the leader's removed from the map. Now, that doesn't necessarily kill him, though, in the advanced game. I need to swap batteries out, so this is a good time for a little break. So if you get a retreat result, you have to retreat 2 hexes away from the hex where you defended. You can go through unoccupied hexes in enemy zone of control, but for each such hex, you lose a manpower point additionally. You can't go through places you can't move. And they specify them all. I find that a little overkill, but had to pad it out to 64 pages or whatever. If you get a route result, you have to retreat 4 hexes. Same restrictions as retreating, and you have to end up 4 hexes away. If the attacker gets an advance after combat, the attacker leader can advance into the hex vacated by the defender. This doesn't cost it movement points. You've already paid to enter that hex. And then you're allowed to move directly from one enemy zone of control to another. And as long as you're not fatigued by the combat result, remember the D results give you fatigues, which could come with an advance. You're allowed to continue moving if you have additional movement points. All right, cav retreat. If an enemy infantry leader is marching into a hex adjacent to a cav leader, or it's selected to perform a march adjacent to the cav leader, or if it advances into combat adjacent to the cav leader, the cav can retreat. Once the attack's declared, though, they can't. So, I mean, you got to give them time. But the cav retreat option is voluntary. The cav leader will be flipped to its fatigued side. Doesn't matter whether it's already fatigued. And its strength marker flips to its disorganized side. It doesn't matter if it's already disorganized. Then it retreats 2 movement points. No, I'm sorry. I lied. Let's see. The enemy leader loses 2 additional movement points as if he attacked. You're basically pushing against him, screening, whatever, and causing him some problems. So you take 2 of his movement out of his box. The cav player rolls a die. If he rolls a 6, he loses a point of strength. This could wipe him out. And then takes a route result, where you retreat 4 hexes away as if it's a normal route. When the retreat's completed, the enemy leader can then continue moving. And he could keep chasing that cav if he wants. If there's multiple cav leaders, they can retreat together, rolling a single die for a loss, but they have to retreat as a stack in that case. If they're stacked with infantry leaders, the infantry can't retreat, but the cav could, and could screen still. Burning railroad stations costs you, you have to have the manpower of 2. It costs you 4 or 6 movement points, depending if you're infantry or cavalry. And you put a burn marker there. And it can never be burned again. It'll be worth victory points at the end of the game. And I think it's the number on the station. So some stations aren't worth burning, I think. There's some zeros up here. Oh, my zoom is not good. Old camera. I have a new one, not all that new, a couple years old, but it comes out kind of yellowy and I didn't like it. Entrenchments, breastworks will double your strength. Garrison markers are an intrinsic garrison of 1 or 2 strength points. They're not affected by the breastworks that they're in. They can't attack, they can only defend. I don't think they have a zone of control. Let me see. No zone of control of their own, but they have to be knocked out of the area. You have to get a retreat or a route in order to destroy the garrison. Any other result will have no effect, including strength point losses. You don't have to actually advance into it. Confederate garrison destroyed markers will be placed in the breastworks there for the rest of the game, which I don't know why that's there. Okay. Again, they had some extra counters to use, I guess. Leaders can build breastworks and forts. However, any entrenchment marker. Okay, so you can use your activation to do this, or during the recovery phase, if you're in your mobile side, you get to freely do it. I'm not quite sure why you wouldn't trigger it. I'm trying to get a grasp on that. I can't think of a good reason. I know I had said there was, but it's not coming to my mind. Okay, if you take a retreat or route, you lose your breastwork. You don't carry it with you. If you do cav retreat, you lose it. If you leave the hex, or if you attack and advance after combat, then you lose it. You're allowed to come out of the breastworks, attack, and then fall back into them. And again, they double you when defending. Forts triple. You're able to move a breastwork up to a fort. Each leader has his own marker. Now, you can stack leaders under a single marker if you like, but you have to follow a reasonable policy for that. Bridges. There are permanent bridges on the map. Some of them are controlled by a player, in which case the other player can never use them. There are also bridges that can be built. Only infantry leaders on their mobile side can build bridges, and it has to be an unbridged minor river hex side. If you meet those requirements, you can place a bridge on the map during recovery phase. It doesn't look, you're not able to build it during your action phase, unlike fortifications, because you'd be able to cross it with other units too quickly. You can't build it if one of the hexes contains an enemy leader with a combat value of 3 or more. And it's going to connect 2 hexes the same way a fort or a bridge on the map would. You own the bridge. You can take it off the board anytime you like. These are not the same bridges that we'll see later. We'll talk about those in a little bit, I think. Okay. Those are, I think, for major rivers. Bridges and movement. You can use the road or pike cost as long as a road or pike crosses the bridge. If you're crossing it without a road or pike, you have to pay the cost of the train, just like you would normally. Zones of control. The secondary go across permanent bridges with roads and pikes, except Union and Confederate bridges when you're not the owner. A bridge on combat gives you a +3 die roll modifier, which is listed over here with the fort as well, as a defender, if you're being attacked across it. Recovery phase, you're allowed to build a bridge next to a leader on mobile side, or you can only do, one of these? No, it looks like you can do them all. Yeah, you can do 3 of them, the first 3. All right, so you can place a bridge, you can entrench, and you can organize. And you can do all 3 of those at once. Normally, if you'd flip your counter for entrenchment, that's all you'd get. You wouldn't get to organize your forces, whatever. So there's a reason to pass rather than flip. I thought there was, I just couldn't remember it. And then the final thing is leaders on their fatigued side are flipped over. Now, these require that you be on your mobile side, so you can't do the 4th one as well, and you don't flip when you do those. You don't flip and unflip. There's a bunch of one-turn scenarios for the basic game, which display certain aspects of the battle. And I strongly suggest the first time you play it, playing the first scenario, just to get a feel how the campaign is going to start. I'm probably screwing up by not doing so, as I've said. Random events. Okay. I think starting on turn 2, the Union player rolls a couple of dice, and there's some events that can come up. There's a chart here somewhere. Down here. In the short scenarios, if they're the short campaigns, advanced game scenarios, only 3 game turns. You do not, you only roll random events. The only ones that you accept are the Union bridge trains. We'll talk about those. One is weather. That can turn into rain. Now, this is a major rain event happening during that turn. Fords become impassable. as do creeks that are not crossed by roads or pikes. All combat takes a -1 to the attacker die roll. Attacks across a creek crossed by a road or pike give the defender a +3 modifier instead of +2. If the leader enters a hex through a hex side crossed by a road, they spend 2 movement points instead of 1. But pikes are still good. Minor and major rivers can only be crossed at bridges, not at fords. Can't build bridges. All right, Lee gets sick. That just means you don't have his bonus. It also means the Union wins ties for initiative die rolls. Normally, the Confederate wins those ties. Reinforcements enhanced. You get some an additional point of reinforcements. Union bridge train. The Union gets a bridge train in their bridge train box, and this is something special. It's not the normal bridging technique. All right, sea movement. Of course, when we get to the naval rules, we got problems, right? I don't like naval rules. These can only be applied on turns 6, 7, and 8. You can take 1 infantry corps leader or up to 4 infantry division leaders in a port hex and remove them, or port hexes, and remove them from the board, put them in the embarked leaders box. The strength accompanies the leader, and they can remain there as long as the player wishes, but you can only have 1 corps leader or 4 division leaders there at any given time, which means you could transfer 1 corps or whatever each turn over those 3 turns. During debarkation, though, you can place them on their mobile side in any unoccupied or Union-occupied port hex. Now, you're going to want supplies for them, which is really the key issue here, the problem of it all. We haven't talked about those supplies yet. Railroad destruction, we've already kind of talked about this. You need a combat strength of 4 or more, and you need to be organized, and you need to be on a railroad hex. And you can't move out, you can't lose, you can't drop below your strength point, and you can't take a disorganized result due to combat. If you make it through the end of the turn, the railroad is destroyed, and there's a little marker for that. All right, supply is kind of complicated. The Confederates get supply from Richmond, Manchester, and Petersburg. Now, Richmond and Petersburg are there and there. I think this is Manchester. No, that's not. And there it goes again. All right, let's see where Manchester is. 4320. Yeah, it's basically part of Richmond. Yeah. And I don't have my paper here. Now, the Confederate railway stations also count as supply sources, even if they've been burned. However, it only functions if you can trace a continuous path of railroad hexes back to one of the Richmond, Manchester, or Petersburg. And it has to be unblocked. We'll talk about blocking supply. Yeah, why don't we talk about it now? It has to cross bridge or ford. Yeah, it's a railway. It's going to do that. Can't cross a bridge built and owned by the other player. That won't be a case in this one. It cannot enter a hex occupied by an enemy leader currently situated in a breastwork or under a breastwork fort marker, nor can it enter a zone of control of an enemy leader situated in a breastwork or breastwork fort marker. And remember the primary, secondary zones based on size. Can't enter an undestroyed garrison, but it can trace through an enemy unit that's not in a fortified position. That's important because the idea there is that they're still moving in that case and that you're just looking at one snapshot of time in terms of where that unit is. It's not going to be able to prevent some supply wagons to come through just because you've got a continuous front. Now, there are different ways you can look at that, but if you want to garrison something to prevent supplies from getting through, you've got to throw them in fortifications, and you got to have enough strength points to project the zones of control where you need them. All right. Union supply sources are the depots, which we have on the board. Those guys there, these guys over here. Ports, sometimes those will, port adjacent to a supply base can count as your supply source. And railroad stations, the Union railroad stations count as supply sources as well. There aren't a lot of them, so that's probably not what you're going to be running off of. The railroad stations have to trace back to Bealton Station, 0115. It's somewhere up here. There it is. It must not have a railroad destruction, and there must be Union leaders whose strength is equal to 6 or more situated in one or more railroad stations in order for those to be functional for supply. At some point or another, this becomes a pain to maintain, and it's not going to get you very far. All right, let me cut to another battery. I think I was a little wrong about supply bases. They don't have to actually be on the ports. They just have to be below the head of navigation. And then you can throw your depots on top of those. Once they're completed, they get a garrison once they're completed. You can use a port adjacent to a supply base as a source, as long as the supply base has a depot at the leader's command and the port's not occupied by a Confederate leader. And that can give you a little bit extra room. Now, the supply lines itself, let's talk about these, because distance matters. Starting with game turn 2, everybody's got to be able to trace supply. You trace it from the leader back to the supply source, and you count hexes, and that's going to be the range. You don't count movement points, but hexes, which is a little weird, but okay. You can't go over stuff you wouldn't be able to move through. You can't go through a breastwork zone of control or hex that the enemy occupies. You can't enter an enemy garrison with it. You can trace it through a hex containing a leader who's not in the breastwork zone of control. We've been through this already. The rules are somewhat repetitive in places in the railroad stations. You know, I think we actually flipped to this to understand what the zones do. But the important thing is the distance. So if it's 0 to 15 hexes, it's going to be primary supply range. Secondary goes out to 29 hexes, and extended goes out to 30. If you're not able to trace a supply line of, it goes out beyond 30. If you're not, beyond 29. If you're not able to trace any sort of supply line of any length, you're isolated. Now, if you're in primary range, you're fine. If you're in any of the other ranges, when you check supply, you have to check the attrition table and make a roll on it. Your force will be disorganized as well, i.e. weaker. Now, the attrition table is based on which type of supply you're, which which not quite in good supply you're in. You roll a die. If you're organized, you get a -1 to the die roll, i.e. you were in supply before, or you haven't been hit hard by combat or whatever. And if you have a small force, 2 or less combat strength, combat value, a moderate-sized disorganized force counts too. And you check to see how many strength points you lose there. All right. Leader removal has been changed a little bit because there's attachments and such now. If your manpower drops to 0, you go back to your core holding box and you can be brought back in. However, if during combat you roll dice and you both roll the same number on the die, unmodified, and either player has corps leaders in play, then you re-roll the die and see whose corps leader dies. And if it's a person who doesn't have a corps leader, they don't lose one in that particular combat. If you lose a corps leader, you're going to be drawing from these chits, which are the replacement counters, at random, and you get a new corps leader. It doesn't affect any of the subordinate leaders. That's something that kind of irked me. I feel like one of those subordinates would probably become the corps leader. Deal with it. All right. Reinforcements, you roll a die on reinforcements to see how many strength points you get. If you don't use them, you lose them. The Union gets one more than the die roll. The Confederates get one less than the die roll. And you might get a bonus to that die roll due to random events. Any leader who's organized can get strength points. And the timing of the sequence of play, I believe, is such that that happens after supply. So they will not be organized if they're not in primary supply range. You want to keep them within the 15 hexes. You can also put new leaders down. You take the leader from a corps leader box, you put the strength marker on the organized side under each one, and you spend however many reinforcement points you want them on there. This has to go for the Union on the depot bearing that command. Cav leaders can go with any depot. Okay, the Cav leaders can use the Army of Potomac depots, which are over there, for this. Now, there's no special case, but if you're going to generate new Cav leaders, you have to do it from there. Cav leaders can use any depot for normal supply. Confederate leaders have to show up in Richmond, Manchester, or Petersburg. And you have a maximum strength to what any leader can possibly hold. So generally, corps leaders can hold 16, division leaders 4, but Cav is weaker. Union Cav 6-2, Confederate Cav 3-1. You're only allowed to take one Cav reinforcement per turn. It's a reinforcement phase. And the Union can have no more than 8 total strength points of Cav on the board. The Confederates can have no more than 4. The Union can only deploy 1 reinforcement point to the 10th Corps and 1 to the 18th Corps. These are the guys down at the James. It's just, even if you break out, you don't, if you connect up with them, you don't really want them to have a lot of forces, so don't worry about it. All right, you're allowed to detach leaders. You take them out of the strength points of the Corps, and you're able to, you grab one of the leaders, you take the strength points up to the 4 or whatever they're able to carry, and you put the division in the same hex as the Corps. And it's in the same state as the Corps was in, so if it's entrenched, disordered, whatever. And then it can go operate on its own. For attachment, it has to happen during the attachment cycle or phase of the administrative cycle, starting on game turn 2. If you have a division in the same space as a Corps, you can absorb that division. You can't exceed the 16 strength points or whatever that the Corps leader can take. The divisional commander now becomes part of this new Corps. And so you can't like keep detaching the same leader and sending him running somewhere or whatever. I don't know why you'd want to do that. Corps leaders can't attach to another Corps. Divisional leaders can't attach divisions. Corps leaders can't attach to divisions. If you have an entrenched division leader joining a Corps, well, any entrenchment status between the two is the same as the Corps' entrenchment status. I don't believe you can even attach something if it's disorganized, but I'm not sure. Might be wrong. Oh, no. It's also the Corps' organization level, or whatever that matters. Okay. The Valley, like I said, you can bring Breckenridge in, and that's going to create a modifier on the Valley table. There are a number of modifiers to it. You have the opportunity, okay. Whether you do it or not, you roll a die. The Valley marker advances 1 box towards the plus, which is the Confederate initiative side. -1, the Valley marker is reduced by a box. There's a table for this over here. It's going to show this. Breckenridge adds 2 to the die roll. But if the Valley marker is currently in the Confederate initiative +1 box, there's a -3 to that. And that's correct from the rules as opposed to on here. But after turn 7, there's a big +4 modifier to the Valley, which means there's a good chance that the Confederates, there's 3 turns there, that the Confederates are going to have to be forced to look at the Valley. Now, if the Valley marker is on the 0 box, there's no particular effect. If it goes into the +1 box, there's a -3 die roll modifier while it's in there. The Confederates are keeping the Valley under their control, basically. However, if it ever makes it into the -1 box, there's a grant marker. The only thing this is used for is to slap it down on the Valley. They have a lee, they need a grant. It doesn't really make sense that you'd put him there, but whatever. And then the Confederates can either do nothing, or they can remove 4 strength points from manpower. If the Confederates do nothing, the Union's going to get some victory points. Otherwise, the Confederates lose some strength points. Now, the Union has the ability to bridge major rivers. Yeah, we're over an hour. I know, killed me. They get these due to random events, and they go over there in one of those little boxes. This is performed just like bridging minor rivers, except you can't do it across an unbridgeable major river side. Not surprisingly. You have to take a bridge from the bridge train box and use that for it, however. There are also some special limits for Drury's Bluff, which is down there. Union leaders within 5 hexes of that cannot bridge the James unless the Confederate garrisons in Chaffin's and Drury's Bluff have been destroyed. Such leaders can bridge the Appomattox, though. There. Yeah. Okay. If they so desire. If I'm mistaken, yeah, the branch is the Appomattox. And the Union 10th and 18th Corps cannot build a bridge over a major river in the first 3 turns of the game. The Union player can remove these bridges. They lose it then. All right. All the advanced game scenarios start at the same time. It's just how long they last. During the first 3 turns, we've already talked about some of this. Some of the leaders don't have the capacity to move. The Confederates get a first turn attack bonus on their first attack. Some phases don't take place. Some of the leaders don't operate. How about victory? I got a problem in my mouth. Losses are going to count for victory points. Burned railroad stations, destroyed railways, and the Valley. These are the 4 things that give victory points. Okay. Losses from combat, retreats, and attrition. all count. Basically anything that's an actual casualty of some sort or another. Attrition might not be casualties, it might be dispatching forces to garrison long supply trains or traces, but whatever. The Confederate manpower is multiplied by 1.5. The Union manpower is then subtracted from the modified Confederate value, and this is how many victory points the Union gets. It could be a negative number, but Confederate losses count more, 50% more, because they don't have many. Each railway that's been burned, the Union gets points for. If they end the turn sitting on a railway that they could have burned, they're considered to burn it at that point. Those victory points are added together and then multiplied by 1/2, and that's additional victory points. Destroying railways, again, if you're sitting in a place where you could destroy the railroad, you're considered to destroy it at the end of the game. Each of the railways is defined, and they each have various values. Some of them are quite high over near Richmond. The valley marker is worth 5 victory points, I believe, if the Confederates lose the valley and don't send more troops in. Yeah, there it is. You add the victory points to a sum, and you compare it based on the length of the game. The Union is going to have to get more victory points the longer the game goes. Makes sense. The game can end in an automatic victory if the Union parks a leader with combat value 4 or more for 2 consecutive action cycles in Richmond or Manchester. That's down there. Or, and at the end of the second action cycle, the leader must be able to trace a primary supply range to the Union supply source. And that's it. I remember this being a lot of fun. One of the opposed times I played it, I was playing the Confederates. When I played it solitaire, I'm not as good against myself. When I was playing it as the Confederates, I'm thinking, I'm Lee. I have to keep shifting my defenses and falling back. It's totally a game about maneuver. Well, the Union slipped behind me. So I had the Union between me and Richmond, and that did not go well at all. We played a couple of turns after that became apparent. I couldn't get back around him. It's very hard to get around someone who can keep falling back defensively, and it was becoming quite clear that it was game over. Other times I've played, though, it's followed more of a historical path. And we're almost out of time.